Fallout 4 is done. Released in August 2016, Nuka World was its last DLC, and other than a possible upcoming VR release, the game won't be getting any new content. Since its release in 2015, the game has been polarizing, with many feeling Bethesda was getting lazy, using an engine that dates back a decade, with visuals that were nowhere close to its contemporaries. Others viewed the game as a worthy sequel. So I figured it would be a good time to look back and share some of my final thoughts on what made Fallout 4 the polarizing game it is. The most obvious thing to talk about first is all the post-release content. Bethesda has been doing piecemeal DLC for years, but Fallout 4 was its first foray into the very divisive idea of a season pass. Season passes are largely seen as a cheap way to get people to pay for content of unknown quality and release dates. And that's not far from the truth. Bethesda released the season pass at $30 with the promise of at least a $20 discount. Of course, that discount was offered before we even knew what type of content it would be. It's a back and forth argument of value. I consider the season pass a good purchase as I've gotten plenty of hours out of the $30 it cost. However, if I had known the types of content we'd be getting, I may have opted to buy it piecemeal. I don't think Fallout 4's DLC as a whole was bad, but it certainly wasn't that good. Excluding Far Harbor, each piece feels unfinished. There is so much potential in Automatron, Vault-Tec, and Nuka World that will never see the light of day, and it feels like Bethesda stretched their resources too thin to produce enough content to justify the eventual $60 price tag. I won't go into each of these content pieces as I've already done reviews of them, but it's easy for me to say that I felt like I got more value out of the 3 pieces of DLC in Skyrim than the 6 for Fallout 4. Far Harbor stands alone as the one piece that lived up to what a Bethesda DLC pack should be. The others offered up some extra content, but just didn't live up to my expectations. Hopefully, Bethesda learns that if you're going to offer up a season pass, you better have the content to back it up. Season passes can be seen as a sort of loyalty discount to a company's biggest fans, but if you fail on the promise of good content, you may lose that loyalty in the future. The other post-release content that I feel caused some issues are the mod tools. Fallout 3's mod tools were released 2 months after the game. Skyrim's were released 3 months after the game, and how long did it take Fallout 4's? 5 months. Considering the anticipation and disappointment that followed with Skyrim's creation kit delays, you would think Bethesda would have put more effort into a quick rollout of the mod tools. I know some of you might be thinking, this sounds like a first world problem. Boo-hoo, you have to wait 5 months to mod your game. But really, the people that it hurt the most were Bethesda themselves. 5 months is a long time for anyone to be captivated by a game, especially a single player one, and just seeing the current state of the Fallout 4 mod community, it seems that either loyal fans really didn't like the game, or the delay just killed the excitement. Skyrim's mod community has flourished for years after its release, and the Fallout 4 community seems to be about half dead a year later. By the time the mod tools arrived, most of the big fans had already sunk 200 hours into the game. To make things worse, they botched the release of mods on consoles that had been promised the year previous. Most console users had already moved on to the next big titles by the time mods were coming out, and PS4 users were understandably angry over being left out of the full experience. So are users entitled to quickly release mod tools? Of course not. Bethesda is a company that can choose to release those tools or not, but it's foolish to think it wouldn't affect the game's perception. People make jokes about fans fixing Bethesda games, but to an extent it's true, and delaying mods only cemented the issues Fallout 4 had and killed the excitement that comes from mods breathing new life into the game. I think something no one denies is that Fallout 4's story has issues. The relationship to your child and spouse is implied, but your backstory amounts to about 2 dialogue choices. As soon as you meet your family, they're gone, and let's be honest, Bethesda is not Naughty Dog. They can't produce a cinematic enough experience in 15 minutes to make a connection to this virtual family. To some, this sounds like a small detail, but it hurts the story in a big way. The motivation to find your child seems forced and separates the player from the player character. The emotional disconnect is exaggerated by the newly voiced protagonist, because while I thought the performances were great, the idea that this character is you was much more difficult to accept than the classic silent protagonist. And while I personally thought the overall story of the game was competent and pretty interesting, it suffered from this very integral lack of feeling from the beginning. It was a good idea to include several factions like the Institute and have the players interact with each of them. However, the plot suffered from the fact that the game gives you opportunities to be friends of each for extended periods of time. For example, in New Vegas, picking certain factions will almost immediately lock you out of several quests, whereas in Fallout 4, there are only a few breaking points late in the game that will actually sever your ties to a certain faction. And in fact, there are at least a few faction quests required to complete the game, no matter what allegiance you plan on having. These factions certainly give the player more choices than was ever available in Fallout 3, but fails to connect in the same way. Just like every Bethesda game since Oblivion, it wants you to see almost all the content in one playthrough. This level of accessibility kills the experience. Being cut off from certain quest lines and factions makes new playthroughs more exciting and enticing. When you realize playing a Minutemen or Brotherhood playthrough only changes a very small amount of quests, it's more difficult to get excited for a new character when you've already played 80% of each faction's content. People may get annoyed at being cut out from quests, but sometimes players don't know what's good for them. Bethesda needs to stop hand-holding and force players to make decisions that can really alter the way the entire playthrough will go. Emerging from the story, another related sore spot seems to be the dialogue of Fallout 4. Unlike previous entries in the series, dialogue is almost entirely linear, with almost no outcome changing depending on what choices you make. So while you can pick whatever faction you want to be allied with, your dialogue choices within those factions has little to do with the overall outcome. Players want to think their character is having an impact on the world as a whole, and Fallout 4's lack of skill checks and dialogue really dulls that feeling. The abandonment of skills goes right along with that. While Fallout 4 still had the special stats the game is known for, it replaced the idea of discrete skills with perks. So instead of a lockpicking skill, you have a lockpicking perk. Now, I for one actually really enjoyed this system. I think creating more custom and varied characters is easier, and the game allows you to prioritize your perk points more effectively than the previous skill points. However, not including perks in the dialogue choices or quest-related skill checks caused many to resent the replacement system. I don't think that would have been the case if you had been able to use your perks during quests. Honestly, it could have produced even more unique scenarios where you could use something like Idiot Savant to pass a speech check or Party Animal to talk down some drug dealers. Hopefully next time around Bethesda uses these new systems in unique ways, because if their history tells us anything, they aren't going away anytime soon. So far, this has been a video examining the parts of Fallout 4 that made it divisive. I don't want to leave the impression that I didn't enjoy it, because I certainly did. Most of the ideas in this video are just examining why the community feels so strongly about the game, but a few of the mechanics and ideas that people hate are actually the ones that made me like the game. For one thing, the combat isn't terrible anymore. It's fast-paced, has a deep but easy to understand crafting system, better enemy AI, and loot mechanics. Many say this takes away from the RPG aspect of the game, but let's be honest, Fallout hasn't been a traditional RPG for almost 20 years. Even Fallout New Vegas, which is cited as the true spiritual sequel to the originals, has more action-oriented combat than Fallout 3. Looking around the industry, this isn't new. Final Fantasy is an action game now. The idea that turn-based combat was going to be the main element of a game in 2015 is kind of ridiculous. And as far as the idea of RPGs go, turn-based combat isn't essential to the genre. As long as you've got skill progression, experience points, and weapon upgrades, you're an RPG. Settlement building has also been criticized, but I don't exactly know why. It's definitely new to the Fallout series, but isn't even close to being new for Bethesda games. Like any other company, they try to go with what the fans want, and seeing the vast amount of custom player housing in every single game they've made obviously made them think this was a perfect idea. No longer do you need to understand complex modding tools to make a place that's your own. They dabbled with this in Skyrim's Hearthfire expansion, so it should be no surprise this was introduced. And for someone like me who thinks player housing is one of the best tools to ground a player in the reality of the game, it was a great addition. Was it perfect? No, not even close. They prioritized it too often and didn't provide enough variety in the settlement locations, but for the most part it was a very unique system that added a great deal of immersion to the game. I think Fallout 4 is a great game hidden under a pile of mistakes. So many things about the game seem like really smart evolutions of Bethesda's previous efforts, but at the same time it feels like they didn't channel the freedom their previous games had. Todd Howard talks a lot about tone, and how it affects how a game feels. I think for the first time in years they failed to get the tone right. This was not my favorite Bethesda game, but it certainly wasn't my least. The rhetoric surrounding Fallout 4 sounds exactly like how Fallout 3 was initially received. To some extent, they will never be able to please people who put too much stock in nostalgia. I'm glad they took a chance and tried something different, even if only some of it worked. In total, I have logged 272 hours playing Fallout 4. If I felt this game wasn't worth playing, I would have stopped a long time ago. Like every Bethesda game before it, there will always be a place for it in my library, and I'm sure I'll go back to it many times in the years to come, despite its flaws. Okay, everybody, that was my video for this week. I hope you liked it. If you did, give me a thumbs up. If you didn't, I think you know what to do. Leave me a comment in the comments section. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button wherever it is if you want to see more videos like this one in the future. Coming up next week, I might have a video on Until Dawn, the PS4 exclusive, or I might have a video on bottlenecking the GTX 960. I haven't exactly decided what I'm doing yet, but there's going to be a new video next week. Sorry there wasn't one last week, but just got busy with work. But hopefully you stick around for those, and I'll see you then.